here's a quick word from our football educational partners over at the Scouting Academy.
Listen, we've said it all the time. If you love the analysis and you're passionate about football, then you really need to check out the Scouting Academy. Whether you're a football coach, aspiring writer, or even aspiring football agent, the Scouting Academy is really a perfect place for you to learn and develop your skills as an analyst. With curriculum that spans over 375 years of coaching and personnel experience, the Scouting Academy offers you a 16-week online course that you can tailor and build to meet your needs and your interests. Whether you're learning about wide receivers or defensive linemen, you can make the experience what you want it to be. Listen, I've said it to you on this podcast many times. I've spent my own money, my own time, and time away from my friends and family because I am just this passionate about this game. And the Scouting Academy is the place where I really feel like I've learned the most I've ever learned about the game of football. It's made me a better analyst. It's made me a better person in terms of the coaching I do on the field. I can't say enough great things about it. If you have any questions about the Scouting Academy, please don't hesitate to reach out to Dan Hatman on Twitter or reach out to the Scouting Academy online via email. I'm open to all questions as well. Heck, I'm still even a student there myself. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I really think that once you learn all the tools and gain the knowledge that they have to offer, I really think you're going to be absolutely excited about the game of football again.
This is the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast.
This is where it all counts. This is why we're here. This is why each one of us are here.
And now, here's your host.
And we are back. This is the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I am Matt Caraccio, and the summer seminar series keeps rolling on. We are looking at movement science and skill acquisition, and I am so privileged to be joined by really one of the people that got me kind of started in this area because of his book Game Changer, and that's author as well as elite performance analyst Dr. Fergus Connolly. Dr. Connolly, welcome to the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. Delighted to be here.
So, Dr. Connolly, Game Changer. There's a lot of people out there that this might be their first kind of interaction with you and your work. I know it's hard to do this, but can you just quickly give a synopsis of what the heart and soul of Game Changer was really meant to be about? And then we'll kind of talk about what we're going to talk about tonight.
It's really easy to tell everybody what it's about. I'm like everybody listening to the show. I grew up playing sport, as you can tell by my accent, not in the States, but I grew up playing sport, playing team sport, and I've just always been fascinated about how can you get a team of young men or women to win in a team sport. I've been fortunate over the last 15, 20 years to work in the NFL, college football, NBA, English Premier League, international rugby. And in every single one of those team sports, you notice or you find out that the principles in every sport are essentially the exact same. And I wrote Game Changer last year because as I was coming through, like all of your listeners, there was no one book out there that explained the principles behind what it took a team sport to win. And I wanted to write it so that the next generation of coaches coming through had a starting point, a foundation text or a foundation book that they could start with and develop their own philosophy from there.
And that's exactly, I think, what intrigued me so well is that 35,000 foot view that your book took. And believe me, by saying that, it's certainly not an understatement that it goes in great detail. It's certainly something that I think it takes a broad approach to all sport, which I think is so fascinating, so challenging, yet you accomplish it with such elegance, to be frankly honest.
Oh, so I'm blushing.
Well, that's what we're doing. That's what we're trying to get you to do. But Dr. Connolly, I think that the thing about this particular publication, I think something that all of our listeners out there, and we have a passionate listener base of of fans out there of American football that really want to learn how to kind of read between the lines, look at the game of football and get closer to that field of play, not just by understanding the scheme, but maybe even understanding kind of the principles, as you put it, that guide really any type of team sport. Because I think as evaluators, sometimes we forget about that and we get so caught up in traits and we get so caught up in athletic numbers, yet we're really not contextualizing them properly. So I was wondering if we can kind of take a look at how you look at the game itself, because Game Changer is really divided up, as I said, quite elegantly into really just a couple of big concepts: the game, the coach, the player. And I think that the game aspect, how you kind of go through and I guess what I want to say is generalize the game, the field of play in all sport is fascinating. And I think it gives such a great insight to how we can grow and evolve our understanding of American football and any sport for that matter. So can you kind of take us a little inside the game? I think that's a great thing to look at tonight. What is the game, and how do you look at the game as a principle, as a place where athletes are kind of coexisting?
I used to start many of my presentations or speeches, talks in public with the sentence, "I'm only interested in winning." And when it's not a flippant statement, but as coaches, it doesn't matter what your role is in the team. Your objective is to win. Wanting to win and winning doesn't make you a bad person. It's how you deal with it. But, as all of these coaches that will coach at the weekend, you have to ask the question that you just asked: what happens in a game and how do we win? And when you look at every team sport, whether it's rugby, soccer, football, the principles are the same. In other words, if you're trying to score an offense, every team tries to create space, because when they create space, their players have more time. On defense, you try and close space, because then you reduce the amount of time your opponent has. And being fortunate to work in these different sports, it suddenly dawned on me that the core elements are the exact same. If you go and sit and watch any high school game or any small game of soccer, football, it doesn't matter. The principles are the same. And particularly in basketball and in soccer, some of the best athletes or best players have learned on the street or learned on courts or yards in neighborhoods on their own. And then when we start to coach them, we start to make things really intricate. And like you said, we talk about schemes and tactics. But many of these kids learned that on their own on back streets. So it's really studying that and trying to understand what are the similarities. And what you start to realize are that the creation of space is key. But the real secret, I think, of the book is that it really unravels the fact that what you're trying to do is you're trying to preserve that instinct that great players had, that they learned themselves automatically: creation of space. Creating space gives me time, and when I have time, then I've got better opportunity to execute my skills. And in a game moment, I'll never forget when I was at the Niners, Vernon Davis, there was a particular clip of him catching a ball along the sideline, and I watched this piece of film time and time again, and it was then that it dawned on me that there were 4 things that just happened at that moment. He was in the right place at the right time where he was supposed to be. Technically, he had the presence of mind, the ability to catch the ball, the skill level. Psychologically, he could recall the play, remained calm, and executed what he was supposed to execute. And physically, as we all know, with someone like a Vernon Davis, he's a physical freak in the best use of the word. So those 4 things all just happened to come together, not in sequence, not one after the other, but all together. And that execution of skill is the very same thing that happens in every single team sport. You saw it last night in the NBA. You'll see it, week in, week out. So that's what happens at a particular moment in a game. So our job is to build that. And the last point about it is these things happen so fast that elite athletes don't have time to think. It just happens, and you're trying to train that instinct. Yes, they know where they're supposed to be, but when it all comes together, they're not thinking. They're just executing on habit and on instinct.
And I think what's fascinating, and I'd like to kind of take this away from what you just said. I think one of the key phrases that I left your book or your chapter on the game with was space equals time. That was just something that I found very profound, and it begins to resonate. And I see it popping up in so many different areas all over when we start talking about skill acquisition and movement science and team sport. Can you just a little bit elaborate maybe on that? And if you can, a typical running play in a game of football, any of your experiences will do. Just if you can kind of take us and the listener through some of those moments and principles that are existing from how the formation and the structure can actually create some initial space, that ball circulation and all those little things that you really kind of go into in this particular chapter that might help our evaluative eye move a little bit more smoothly through the actual play. Can you maybe take us behind the scenes a little bit in that respect?
Sure. So there are two phrases that I use in the book quite a lot, which have been adopted very widely. One is work backwards from the game. In other words, study the game as much as you can and try and replicate that in practice. The other one is that time doesn't create space; space creates time. And you'll hear people say, "Oh, such and such a player makes something look slow, or they make time for themselves." That's not quite true. What happens is they create space, or players or teams and schemes and formations are aimed at creating space. You can't create time. And from a coaching perspective, and from an interpersonal perspective, the most valuable thing we have is time. That's the most valuable thing you can give anyone. We can't compress it or we can't do anything with it, but we can create space. What truly great players do, for example, like a Frank Gore, what they do is they create space for themselves, which appears to give them time. So it's the creation of space in the movement and the synchronization of players. That's what you're trying to do. And good schemes and formations, fundamentally, whether or not the coaches recognize it, that's what they're trying to do. And the reason that, some coaches might be listening going, well, I just want to know X's and O's. And that's fine. And you want to know plays, that's fine. But if you understand the principle, you can come up with your own. You don't need to copy them from someone else. And that's what I want to help coaches do is if you understand the principle, now you can come up with your own. But more importantly, when the whistle goes, when the ball is snapped, your players can create it when everything goes downhill. I used to joke at some of the teams I work with, offensive coordinators would come up with so many different plays and so many different combinations. And, quarterbacks would just say to me, we've got so much to learn. In reality, if the players have principles, very few of those plays are actually executed. First of all, very few of the ones that are learned are ever used, and very few of the ones that are called are actually executed the way they're supposed to. So to be really honest, a lot of it is quite pointless. What's more important is to try and instill principles which the players themselves can adapt to as the game evolves, as it based on what they see in front of them.
And to kind of go with that, you talk about unfolding as the game unfolds in front of them working through it. And you talked about working backwards from the game and synchronization. I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, do you think that how do coaches really impact it? How do you think coaches impact that part of the execution on the football field? How is it that they are capable of impacting it on the field? Is there a way that they are?
Oh man, I'd love to give you an honest answer, but I could be in a lot of trouble. Well, I'll give an honest answer. I think why my perspective is unique is that there is no other sport like football, particularly in the NFL or in college, where the coach can dictate or is in communication with a decision maker like a quarterback on the field. So in rugby, the decision maker, the quarterback or the 10, they have to play what's in front of them. The coach can't communicate. So the importance of decentralizing the decision making to the player on the field or in possession of the ball, that's a huge part of rugby. Same in soccer. In football, because you can communicate, to the quarterback, there's less of a need to educate the player or to decentralize decision making. So many coaches, have perhaps almost a belief that it's PlayStation they're playing, where they can, and that doesn't encourage true development of the quarterback. And very often, I don't know if the phrase is used that much, but when people talk about players who have an X factor, when coaches refer to a player that has an X factor, what they're saying is that player didn't listen to me and did something that I didn't tell him to do, didn't plan on him doing, but it still worked out really, really good. That's what great players have. They play what's in front of them. So I think the best coaches generally are the more experienced, who give the player guidelines but don't impose in a dictatorial way exactly what the player is supposed to do, because you never know what the player is actually going to face when the ball is snapped. And that's why the ability to transfer leadership onto the field is something that I think American sports can learn a lot, particularly in football. Train the quarterbacks to be able to make better decisions based on what they can see. It's that decentralization of leadership and of decision making.
No, and I think that's a fascinating point, and specifically to what you just said there about them not knowing what they're going to face. I mean, it seems if you're talking about that we have to instill more adaptability within our actual players. They have to be ready to kind of handle more than one situation. Is that too far of a stretch, or would you say that would be fair?
That's exactly it. Because, and again, experience working with, special operators or special groups, you cannot prepare for every single, formation, sequence, strategy or tactic you're going to face. You can prepare broadly speaking, and you can anticipate with some degree of probability, but it's still chaotic. And what you're trying to do is to give the players the ability to adapt. And the faster that they can adapt, the faster you can stay ahead of the opponent. I speak about John Boyd in the book, who is, and those listeners who get the opportunity just to read a little bit about John Boyd, but he was an Air Force pilot whose a lot of his writings are used still to this day by the Marine Corps, actually not by the Air Force as much, but his understanding of decision making has influenced so many people in so many different areas. And essentially, in a nutshell, what he's saying is that the faster the two people, take for example boxers in a very simplistic model, one boxer is anticipating, so he goes through a decision-making cycle and then he acts. If the other boxer can go through his decision-making cycle before the punch has landed, then he can anticipate. And that's what's happening in football, just on a bigger scale with more players. So what you're trying to do is to train your players to adapt to what they see in front of them and to act quicker than the opponent can stop them. You can give them broad direction, but you're really at the mercy of the player's ability to adapt to what they see in front of them. So the better that you can train that in practice, the better the player is going to perform on the field.
And I think that's, for lack of a better word, I think that's the one, gazillion-dollar prize or question, is being able to attain that in an actual environment in practice, and being able to create that on a regular basis is certainly, I think, everybody out there that's listening, that's a coach, is always trying to do. And I think, Dr. Connolly, if you wouldn't mind, if we kind of go to the point now where we start talking about the game from the principles that you kind of talked about. You said that you presented in terms of, if I'm correct, you have principles and then you have moments. Can you just discern a little bit of what the difference between those are, just for our listeners? Because specifically, I'd like to, if you don't mind, speaking to an actual play. You talk about the chaotic nature of a play itself, but you talk about the structure, and I think that's what you were talking about earlier. a real principle-based look at the actual play itself. You talk about player circulation, ball circulation, the relationship and sequencing, that synchrony that you talk about, as well as the structure. How do those 4 elements kind of interplay with one another in a moment, in an actual principled setting of looking at a play? How does that all kind of weave together that might inform us better as coaches and evaluators?
So this is a brilliant question because, again, going back to that key phrase, work backwards from the game. What happens in coaching a lot of time is that we have a set pattern that we do every week, and we've set drills that we do, and we run over cones and we run over bags and we do all of that. That's fine. But to truly develop a player, we should watch the film and understand why a particular play worked well or why it failed. And it's a lot easier, obviously, to see where it failed. When a play fails, and this is the process that I went through at all of the sports, a play will generally fail because of 4 things. And this is true for young kids right up to the elite level. It will fail based on structure, which is the formation. And the reason that I use these 4 is so that when you sit down with the player the day, 2 days, or 3 days after the game, you're going to correct him on 4 things and I'm talking game sense perspective. You're going to talk to him about formation. So perhaps when the play started, regardless of the sport, I'm speaking very, very general, he was in the wrong position. Now, again, do you just tell him exactly the formation, or do you try and educate him as to why there should have been slightly more of a gap, he should have been a little bit more to the left or whatever? But that's part of game sense, is the formation, his positioning in relation to his teammates and to his opponents. The second one then is ball circulation. How does the player act when the ball is moved? And what is his understanding of the game? So if it's an offensive moment, a defensive moment, in a defensive moment, you would want him to move closer to the player, but keep an eye on the ball. And then in relation to his team and his teammates, you're again educating him on, in a defensive moment, I want you to be close to your opponent, or I want you to be in contact with your opponent, or closing space. And then the last one then is the sequence and timing of that. Knowing when to make that move. So just educating the player on what we call game sense, game intelligence, or we have all these words that are like a black art. We everybody, there's a guy sitting around a bar and going, he doesn't have game sense. Yeah. But nobody can tell you what that is. Well, this is what it is. It's these 4 things. It's structure. It's the relationship to the ball, relationship to the teammates, and then the sequence and timing. And that's where that is. And the reason I list those 4 is so that when you sit down with the player, now you've got a framework. So you can say, was he in the right position? He was. Did he understand where the ball was going? Did he move properly in relation to the ball? Yes, he did. Did he know where his teammates? Yeah, he seemed to. Well, what about his timing? No, his timing was off. He moved too soon or he moved too late. So that's the process by which you start to help develop, and again, work backwards from the game. Forget about the drills per se. Look at the game.
And I think that's a really brilliant comment there, because I think that as evaluators, as fans of a game, regardless of sport, I think that you're pointing to really something very important, which is really taking in that environment, the environment and context with which the actual play is happening. That goes with, down and distance. That's talking about score and weather and you name it. It's all those factors kind of all rolled into one. And then even more discreetly, as you pointed out, structure,
yes,
spacing. And I think that's a really kind of really discreet and concrete way to begin that evaluation process. And I want to ask you a question I think that plagues many fans of a game, whether it be American football or even if you're playing rugby or if you're playing soccer. My question to you is athletic ability. You mentioned it several times at different points throughout the book, especially within the section on game. Is athletic ability and the athletic capacity of a player, is it overrated in traditional coaching and traditional sport, or do you feel it's appropriately rated? I mean, how would you look at the athletic capacities of an individual, their raw power, speed, strength? Do you think we make too much of that? Or do you think it's appropriately balanced? I mean, what has been your experience in those different areas? Because I'm sure you've worked with a variety of athletes. You even talked about special ops and things of that nature. How is that raw capacity or athletic ability really? How does that weigh?
Again, an excellent question. I think I have to be careful how I answer this, because I've made my living largely on developing the physical attributes. However, with that experience comes the recognition that there is a limit to the influence of the physical ability on the outcome of a game. And I keep coming back to the scoreboard. How do we affect the scoreboard? Now, what's important? There are a number of things in the US. There is a great appreciation for statistics, for numbers, for variables, and for values, a greater appreciation than there is in Europe, and a better understanding. But with that also comes, a duty to recognize that just because someone's bench press or 40 is good doesn't make them a good player. What it does allow, and this is where the confusion sometimes reigns, is somebody with a good 40 can compensate for poor game sense, like I just outlined. So, for example, if a DB is out of position and they're a little bit faster and can jump higher, they can compensate by being out of position. And we all know great players, Deion Sanders, for example, who I'm not saying he was a bad player, but because they had that freakish athletic ability, could compensate and could tread maybe a finer line between playing strictly to a scheme and then how they wanted to play the game. So athletically gifted players make some good coaches look great. That's the truth of the matter, because they can compensate. Now, but at the same time, we still see some very, very game intelligent players, or players with great game sense, who compensate for poor physical ability. But I think that the scales are weighed a little bit too much on the physical qualities. The reason for that is because until Game Changer was written, there was no way to assess or to profile players holistically. In other words, we can measure their 40, their bench, the weight. We can measure arguably everything in the physical domain. We don't have measures for psychology, skill, technical ability, or tactical ability. So TTPP, technical, tactical, psychological, we don't really have measures for. Physical, we do. And because we can measure the physical abilities, we tend to emphasize those more because we can record the improvements in those areas. That's where the confusion sometimes lies. And it's neither good nor bad, but it's something that good coaches need to be aware of.
No, and I think that's a fabulous point. And again, I don't want to be too crazy with the time here. You're being more than gracious with it, and we're very appreciative of it. I was just wondering if we could kind of maybe end with one or two more questions. The first question is technical and tactical and psychological. I think that's a fascinating thing that some of our listeners, especially myself at times, get them confused, may not really be able to discern exactly what you're pointing to. Psychological, I think, is for sure something that we all understand, but I think it's underappreciated in the evaluation process for sure. Not to say that we have to know your emotional state on your 5th birthday and how that impacted you on the field of play today, but rather the psychological impact of the moment and the score and everything that's occurring at once. I think that's fascinating, but technical and tactical, some might say that's the same thing. That's not the same thing. Can you kind of maybe delineate the two for us a little bit?
Sure. So a few weeks ago, I spent a few days at St. Francis Academy in Baltimore High School, and we went through their players using that format, TTPP. And the physical, we have those measures. Psychological, we broke it down into a very simple method for asking, and I use 3 measures: emotional, cognitive, and spiritual. Spiritual is like spiritual and social. How do people interact with others? In other words, are they a good teammate? Are they part of the group? Do they feel needed? Do they feel wanted? Cognitive is, how do they learn? Are they understanding what we're telling them? And then emotional is example things. How do they handle criticism? How do they handle discipline on the field? Tactical is their game sense. Do they understand the formation? Do they understand the structure? Essentially, are they in the right place at the right time? And technical is how do they execute when they're there? Now, all of these things, I call them coactives because they don't ever operate in isolation. And they are you're right to say that they're very related. So in other words, if you take anybody in the O-line, when they play, obviously the position that they're in will impact how they apply their skill. But players, and the reason that we use this method is to be able to identify one very important thing. What is the limiting factor? So the coaches have a limited amount of time to spend with the player, and they can identify very quickly what is the one thing that is holding this offensive line player back. Was he in the right position? Yes, he was. Okay, then let's look at him tactically. Are his physical attributes, like, is he strong enough? Is he big enough? Can he handle? So it's to identify technically what he needs to improve on. And very, very important quote I learned from a great Dutch coach years ago is, it's not about doing as much as is possible. It's about doing as much as is necessary. And the only way you do that is by identifying what is the limiting factor. So when you look at your player, what is holding him back? And I would almost guarantee you 9 times out of 10, it is not a physical thing, because in the US, we have great strength coaches. We do lots of speed training. But if we want to truly develop a high school player, what's that limiting factor? Is it his technical ability in contact? Is he able to move a player? Or is he compensating because of strength? And particularly in high school, the bigger player tends to dominate. But at St. Francis, that's something that we were concentrating on. Just because the player is bigger, we still want to assess his skill, his technical ability, his positioning, his technique, to make sure that that is right, so that he can continue to develop long term. And that's why it's so important. And that's what, that is what true development is about. That's what coaching is about. It's about developing a player. It's not about adding 5 pounds on the bench. So that's why I'm so passionate about it. That's why it's so important. So can we identify, break it down, and then can we improve the player? Because that's our duty as coaches, not to, like I say, put 5 pounds on the bench.
Well, I mean, I agree with you, and I chuckle only because that was something I was going to kind of ask you. You kind of answered my last question right there, but I'll still ask it anyway in case there's something more. You were kind of, I wanted to ask you is, what do you think the enduring message of your publication of Game Changer is? And then I have to ask you, are we going to have a sequel? Because I know I've heard you kind of whispering about a more actionable version of this, more like the theoretical basis is now set. Mm-hmm. So I'll let you get to that in a moment. But what do you think that enduring message is? Because for coaches out there that are interested in now taking this discussion further, mm-hmm. What do you think the entire book itself, as we take it through, what do you think an enduring message of Game Changer is for those evaluators and coaches out there that really haven't yet been informed with it?
Okay, well, 4 pieces of the best advice I can give coaches are: 1, work backwards from the game. Forget about the drills, forget about the cones and everything. Start from the game and work backwards. Second piece is, always ask yourself this question: does it affect the scoreboard? If it doesn't translate directly to the scoreboard, get rid of it. Third piece of advice is, watch the game from as wide a view as possible at twice speed. So that stops you from looking at the detail, and what you start to see now is you start to see movement. You start to see faster movement. So sit back, watch the game from as wide a view as possible, and watch it at double speed. And the fourth piece of advice, I think, is go to the lowest high school game that you can watch and just sit in the corner. Don't sit centrally. Sit to the side and watch the game diagonally, and just watch the movement of the kids. Forget about the names on the shirts and watch the instinct by which they play and watch how they learn. Because that's when you will start to see and understand how the players that you're communicating with, how they learn. So take those 4 pieces of advice. And I think it will just allow you to look at the game in a different way. I've got a world exclusive for you. I've just spoken with a publisher, and we are actually, myself and another colleague, are producing I've got 2 world exclusives for you. We're actually writing a game changer for football specifically.
American football or soccer?
There's only one football. There's only one football. American football. American football. And what I've done is I've taken the principles of Game Changer, and through I'm using, for example, St. Francis in Baltimore. We've got sections of it directly related to high school. We've got the college system from my time with Michigan, and examples from the NFL from my time with the Niners. And the principles are the same, but I just have examples of the different thing. And one of the things you'll be delighted to know are those profiling models that I've used, the TTPP at high school, college, and pro, how we use those. Other things are scheduling. How do you, what does a week look like? How do you optimize your time? So that Game Changer for football will come out later on this year, I'm hoping. And I'm also, there's another book called Protocols, which will take a little bit longer, but it's essentially recipes for, how to improve speed, how to improve those different things. But I wanted to get the overall principles in place first. So, the Game Changer for football, that's the working title. That should be out later on this year. I'm really excited about that because I want to really impact the high school coaches so that they can see honestly what happens at the NFL collegiate system and down, and so that they understand that these principles don't change. It's still the same game. It's still the same game in the NFL, college, and at high school. The principles are the exact same. So how do we develop players, and to move a little bit away from just running gassers, running guys into the ground, and how do we truly develop like a skillful footballer? And the one of the core reasons for this as well is to make the game safer, because it's a wonderful game. It's the truest measure of a man, in my opinion. So how do we build good, healthy players who can play this game and go on to live, great lives?
His name is Fergus Connolly. His book is Game Changer, The Art of Sports Science. I cannot advocate this book enough. I've read it. I've spoken with Dr. Connolly on occasion, kind of citing different passages, asking questions. It has totally begun to change my lens on the very landscape of American football that I watch. And it's changing the way I understand athletes, that I understand how they work on a field of play. And it's just broadened my understanding and deepened my understanding. And dare I say, it's kind of pushed me into a direction where I am reading material probably now at a level that I probably wasn't even reading in college. I'm actually shocked at some of my reading right now. And I'm working slowly. I'm sitting there with a dictionary, but I'm working slowly. But I'm finding it fascinating. And Dr. Connolly, I think that's something that maybe one of the highest compliments that you probably, I know just hearing it from you, that you love hearing, because you want to hear that people are changing, that people are beginning to take your work and expand and broaden and deepen their understanding. I can't advocate this enough. I get
emails on a weekly basis from high school coaches in basketball and in football, sending me their game models and their game plans and their schemes. I try and reply as quick as I can. I'll reply to everybody, but it's truly humbling to get those and to see how people have taken the principles and applied them, because like I said jokingly, my accent, this is I'm not trying to lecture anybody. All I'm trying to do is say, look, here are some other ideas to take, and to go and enjoy the game with your kids and with your players, and look at it in this different way, and take ownership and come up with something new. When I was at the Niners, I used to pester the great Keena Turner about what was it like with Bill Walsh, Harry Edwards, Doc Edwards, and the one key theme that I took from them was he was not afraid to take the principles of the game and come up with something new, and he loved doing that with the game, and that's what I want to see coaches do. Enjoy this game. It's the same with Biff Poggi at Baltimore. This is a wonderful game. We want it to be around for a long time. We want to prepare kids in the best possible way. So we have we're fortunate. We get up in the morning, you know what I mean, and we get to impact these kids. We are very, very fortunate. There's a tougher thing. There are tougher things we could be doing in the evenings.
Well, I completely agree with you, and this discussion is hopefully benefiting many, many listeners out there, as I know it will. If you have not had a chance to go out and purchase Game Changer, I really think you're missing out, arguably, on one of the best books written on sport in probably the last 10 years that I've read. And it's pushed me in a direction, like I said, that has really changed my perspective on the game. And as you can hear from the man himself, he is very, very humble. He is one of the most approachable gentlemen to kind of throw out a question to. And as he says, he replies. And that's one of the most amazing things I think about that, is that you really are fostering this environment and this community. So Dr. Connolly, on behalf of myself and all of our listenership out there, we want to really say thank you so much for sharing your insights on the game. And I know it really has been very, very beneficial to hear some perspectives that I know I was taking notes as you were writing on several of the elements that are going to really go back and influence how I watch football this year when I'm evaluating players, when I'm looking at players in the collegiate ranks. It's really going to influence me.
Well, brilliant. Thank you very much. Maybe I can come back on later on.
Yes, absolutely. And Dr. Connolly, where can we find you on social media, Instagram, anything of that nature? Where can we find you?
So the next week, my new website, fergusconnolly.com, will be up, and everything, you can find everything there. So fergusconnolly.com.
So again, on behalf of Dr. Fergus Connolly and myself, thank you so